for that introduction. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first panel in today's Latinx MiniFest, Whole Neighborhoods Inside Us, Community and Belonging in Picture Books by Mexican-American Authors. I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists, four extremely talented authors who are here today on a Saturday morning to discuss their lovely books with us. So today we have Matt de la Peña, who is the #1 New York Times bestselling, Newbery Medal winning author of 7 young adult novels, including Mexican White Boy and We Were Here, and 6 picture books, including Last Stop on Market Street and Carmela Full of Wishes. In 2016, he was awarded the NCTE Intellectual Freedom Award. Matt received his MFA in creative writing from San Diego State University and his BA from the University of the Pacific, where he attended on a full basketball scholarship. And in 2019, Matt was awarded an honorary doctorate from UOP. So congratulations for that, Matt, and welcome. Then we have Donna Barba Higuera. Donna's middle grade novel, Lupe Wong Won't Dance, was the recent winner of both the Pura Belpré Honor and the Sid Fleischman Award. She grew up dodging dust devils in the oil fields of Central California. She was a daydreamer, constantly blending life experiences and folklore into stories, and now she weaves them into picture books and novels. Donna currently lives in the Pacific Northwest with her husband, 4 children, 3 dogs, 2 frogs, and hundreds of wild birds who flock to her backyard bird feeders daily. Her debut picture book, El Cucuy is Scared Too, is forthcoming from Abram Kids in July of 2021. And her middle grade sci-fi, The Last Cuentista, is forthcoming from Le Vin Querido in August of 2021. So thank you for being here, Donna.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce YuYi Morales. YuYi was born in Jalapa, Mexico, the city of flowers and springs. After migrating to the US in 1994, she struggled with English and loneliness in a culture foreign to her, but found solace in public libraries, where she read children's books with her son and discovered a renewed interest in stories and art. She is now the author and illustrator of many books for children, including the New York Times bestseller Dreamers, and she is a 6-time winner of the Pura Belpré Medal for an outstanding work of literature for children that best portrays, affirms, and celebrates the Latino cultural experience. Other honors include the Americas Award, the Gold Kite Medal, the Christopher Award, the Jane Addams Award, and the Tomas Rivera Award. And in 2015, she received the Caldecott Honor for her book Viva Frida. And our 4th panelist today is Isabel Quintero. Isabel is the daughter of Mexican immigrants. She lives and writes in the Inland Empire of Southern California, where she was born and raised. Her first book, Gabi, A Girl in Pieces, received several awards, including the Tomas Rivera Award, the California Book Award Gold Medal, and the Morris Award for debut YA. One of her favorite memories is of riding on the back of her Papi's motorcycle as a little girl. And she drew from those experiences to create the Pura Belpré honor-winning picture book, My Papi Has a Motorcycle. So welcome again to all of you, and thank you for joining us. And I think let's get started. So this year, the Latinx Mini Conference, the theme is focused specifically on Mexican-American authors and stories. And so I was thinking maybe the best place to start is to just look at the idea of Mexican-American and to ask, what does Mexican-American mean to you, and sort of like where you find yourself situated within that category. And also, how does that identity shape your work, if indeed it does at all? Matt, do you want to get us started with this one?
Sure. So first of all, it's a true pleasure to be on this panel with you all, and thank you to Bank Street for having us. So for me, so I grew up with teenage parents down by the border in San Diego, where I just moved back. And I had 2 sides. So I had my mom's side, and she's white and really I should be able to tell you more specifically what she is, but we don't know because she wasn't raised by her parents, right? So she was raised by her great grandmother and a foster family. So we don't know her side. And then I have my dad's side, who's Mexican, and his parents are from Tijuana. And so I only grew up with my dad's side. So that was my whole experience. However, I guess the position I often write from is feeling on the margins of that experience because I was the lightest. My Spanish was not very strong. So I was kind of always on the side of it, wishing I could be more in the middle of it in a time when we were taught to assimilate. So it was a very complicated background. I love what I see now. It's different. There's an embrace of culture, but my dad, he thought we'd be better off if we didn't speak Spanish. And so that's kind of where I write from.
Thank you. And Donna, do you want to go next?
I can just press ditto on what Matt said. I grew up in Central California, which it's very much agriculture and oil field. So there's a big migrant community, but my family had been there quite some time. And again, like Matt, I had one parent who had a Mexican American background, like second generation. And then my mother's side, which was white and Native American, but on it's complicated. You have one side of the family where you're kind of, for me, I spent time with both sides. So there was a bit of like switching back and forth. And like Matt said, assimilating in certain points. You knew when to act or be a certain way. I knew there were situations where I shouldn't speak Spanish because where I grew up, it could sometimes be dangerous. And so I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. And so I knew that there were times when it was like, I could be with one side of my family and be and act and speak a certain way. And then I knew when to turn it off. So it was a little bit complicated. So being Mexican American when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s was tricky in the town that I grew up in. But I've seen it's changed. I actually looked up one of my elementary schools yesterday to call a librarian there, and it had a link for migrant families. That would have never happened when I grew up. And I was like, oh, this is wonderful, because then people either assimilated or hid. And so that was it. And it sounds very sad, but I look back on it and it's part of who I am. And I'm glad for that because it's part of my life experience. But I think that's what it meant for me as a child. It's something very different now, very different. And now my Spanish is horrible. But when I was in graduate school, I worked in a clinic in South Central, and I was able to speak and use, my Spanish. And the patients who I saw were very courteous and gracious to me because they knew I was struggling with both my language and a little bit with my culture. And that's just the truth. I think a lot of us who grow up here do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to see that this shift away from certainly the urge to assimilate that also when I was growing up here was very present. YuYi, your story is a little bit different because you spent most of your childhood you spent all your childhood in Mexico, right? So do you want to go next?
Sure. Well, exactly. I grew up in Mexico, and I only became something else when I got to the United States. I remember hearing Isabel Quintero speak once about what it meant to be a Latinx person. And she will say at the time she was using the way she would call herself Latina, and which will say, why do I call myself Latina? That's something that only happens when we get to the United States, right? Before that, you are either Mexican, you are from Spain, you are from Honduras, you're from many other different places, but it isn't until you get to the United States that then you start seeing yourself as part of the Latinx community. And I can see how, for me, that was, it kind of points to particularities of who we are. Like when I got to the United States, I didn't identify at all with, for instance, not at all, but with the Chicana community, right? Because they were having different ways of experiencing their identity, and they weren't the ones that I had with me. I feel now that although we always look for the similarities in order to find our strength, makes me wonder what happens when we actually look at the differences. But then we don't see those differences as something that we have to defend against, but something that we are curious about and something that we celebrate, even if someone from El Salvador is not gonna be like someone like me from Mexico, and rather than seeing and looking only for the things that we have in common, so that we can have a link, a connection. How could we also look at those things that are different and still make them part of our connections?
Yeah, that's beautiful. And Isabel, do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences?
Sure. Yeah, and I really appreciate what you just said about you know, looking at differences, which is something that I constantly like when we talk about like, well, we need to be, especially when I worked in elementary school, and well, we got to look at what connects us, what makes us all the same, and why, like, we could all be different and still be friends, right? But I just really appreciate what you just said about that, YuYi, because I think it's something that needs to be said more often and really looked at, because I think that within, when we talk about like being Mexican American, like even that, there's like differences everywhere, right? Like there are things that maybe do connect us, like, okay, we are Mexican American because we have Mexican ancestors and we live in the United States, which really should be Mexican United Statesian. But anyway, that's like a different conversation. But my parents are Mexican immigrants. My mom's from Guanajuato, my dad's from Sinaloa, and they migrated to the US in the 70s, in the late 70s, and they met here. And then the miracle that is me happened, right? Like, but I, like my experience as a light-skinned Chicana, right? Like light-skinned Mexican American is going to be very different from like my brother who is not, right? My brother who is Moreno, or my mom or my dad, right? Like I'm like the odd one out in the family. But growing up, I never saw myself as American, because my mom would always say, like, she would talk about Los Americanos, and in our house, Los Americanos were white or black folk. Like those were Los Americanos. Like I wasn't. We were Mexican. And so, I think like all of my elementary school and my junior high, there was a lot of Latinx people at my schools, and I felt like I didn't fit in, or like I was very, I was different. I was a weird kid. I was a weird kid, right? Like, as many writers are, right? Like I was just like a strange kid, and I didn't fit in to things. Like I wasn't a follower. So if like kids were doing something and they were going to get in trouble and I didn't want to do it, I just didn't do it, which didn't really make for a personality to have a lot of friends, because like, I were going to get in trouble. I don't want to do that thing, right? But when I went to high school, my high school was mostly all white, in Corona, and it was upper class, middle class white kids, and I was not that. Even though I was light skinned, I didn't fit. I didn't fit in, right? Like I remember being called a wetback, and that was the first time, like in junior high, right? And by a little white girl, I remember her name, Jessica Maxfield. Like she called me a wetback and accused us of taking her resources, right? Because it was during the Prop 187 happening. So I was made very aware of my position as like other, at a very young age, whether it be from my parents or from classmates. But it wasn't until college that I realized like what Mexican American, what Chicano was. It wasn't until college that I found terminology for where I was in my place in this country. And even now as an adult, I think it becomes more complicated. Like, what does it mean to be Mexican American, right? Like thinking about nationalism, thinking about like all of these things that continue to other ourselves and continue to promote, imperialism, all these things that are constantly going in my head that I'm like, okay, like I need to slow it down a bit and just like, this is who I am in this country, and this are my experiences, and this is how I see the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's so interesting with categories like this. It's they have to be so flexible. What I love about talking to the four of you is that, all four of you have some shared and also some very, very different relationships to the category, to the Mexican American identity, and that it can be inclusive of someone who was born in Mexico and grew up in Mexico and then had to and then chose to come to the US and make a home here, and then sort of find points of entry into, I guess, US culture. And it can also include someone who was born here and who doesn't speak Spanish and who has never set foot in Mexico, actually, and sort of everything in between, which is kind of amazing. And so going off of, I want to sort of springboard off of what YuYi was talking about too, because again, like the sort of the conference is the Latinx MiniFest, and the theme is Mexican American authors. And I'm just really interested in sort of the tension between Mexican American and Latinx. And I think, there's a lot of sort of solidarity and community building to be found under umbrella terms like Latinx, but also using terms like that, as we were discussing, kind of creates this idea that there's like a monolithic Latinx experience that really doesn't exist. And so I want to talk a little bit about your picture book specifically. And I'm just very curious, like, to what degree you you think you were drawing from like Mexican references specifically, or whether you were sort of writing for a more pan-Latinx readership, or, if that wasn't in your mind at all. And I wanted to start with YuYi with this one too, because I know you did the artwork for your own book. And I think yours was the one that really struck me as having so many like distinct, what I associate as not Latinx, but very distinctly Mexican visual references. So like, I think this is going to be difficult, but you have like the Xolo dogs and the monarch butterflies, things that when I see, I don't think Latinx, I think that's Mexico, like that's Mexican iconography. But yeah, just so maybe starting with YuYi, but all four of you, I would love to hear about, where on that sort of Mexican versus pan-Latinx, I don't know, spectrum you felt that you were drawing from in these picture books in particular.
Yeah, sure. I can tell you that specifically for Dreamers, because I was telling my own story, and my story started in Mexico. A lot of what you see there, especially in the time before the moment where we arrived to the United States, everything there, I even used textures and photographs of things that were Mexican, of things that either I got here, I had it from years ago, like the blouse that the woman is wearing. I use a blouse that I had when I was here in Mexico, and I use all of that textures. I use all the iconography as well, and then you see also some of the things in that when it's part of the United States that are still impregnated from my living, right? And because my living was that, the way I was living was I was living with everything that I had with me that came from Mexico, and I put it in that book in many different ways, like I say, even sometimes literally. I put them there. But I know that for me, I wouldn't know how to make a different book, because that's what is surrounding me all the time. And I know that even as I experiment and I go outside of my comfort zone, everything that I am is always gonna show in my books. And I wanna see that as a strength, and not necessarily feel like, oh, I'm still repeating myself. And it's okay. Sometimes it is okay to repeat ourselves. It is okay to see those things that, because I can tell you that even in Dreamers, I use some symbols of things that I thought were the things that made me less in my own view, in my identity as I was growing up, and put them in the book as something that I realized now, that it took me a whole life to realize that it was my strength. Like the woman is wearing a skirt that is made of paper. And I put that because of my own experiences about what kind of clothing will make me feel like I had some value. And I decided to put that kind of skirt made out of paper, because at the time, not having something to wear to go to a place like the United States was something that hurt me. And I didn't know that the things that I thought were hurting me will eventually be a strength once I was in the United States. So all that iconography that comes from, not only from the places of being Mexican, but also places like class, places like being a woman, and all of those things are always going to be in my books. Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think that some of the visual references like are actually a little bit more universal, as you were saying. Like, for example, the way that there's an image where she's looking at a subway map and the language of the different subway stops. It's like sort of a visual reference to what it looks like when you're trying to navigate a city in a language you don't know. And that could be anybody, any Spanish speaker trying to figure out their way around a city in the US. So
that's right.
And Donna, I wanted to ask you about this too, because I was thinking of El Cucuy, which is the subject of that picture book, which I definitely grew up with. We called him El Coco at my house. And I actually had no idea to what degree El Cucuy reoccurred in other Latinx cultures. But you have this really interesting author's note at the end where you talk about like other variations on El Cucuy, and that apparently there's like a female Cucuy in Brazil. Is that right? Yeah. And yeah, so if you'd like to go next and talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Sure. Apparently the female version is a little more lizard-like. I don't know what that means, but so I thought I was the only one as a kid who had El Cucuy, and my grandmother used to use it to scare me to go to sleep. And then my cousin Rosie, when she would come visit from Mexico City, would use it and click her fingernails and scare me. And I didn't realize until I was actually writing this book and doing research that El Cucuy exists in many forms in many different countries. And the illustrator, Juliana Perdomo, is from Bogota, and she has had a form of El Cucuy. And when she illustrated El Cucuy, when the first illustration I saw, I said, oh my gosh, that's him, except hers had a hood and mine didn't. And it was one of those things that when we talk about similarities and differences in culture, it's one of those things that you realize that we do have those things, and they might be slight variations across different cultures. But it also came, the book came through kind of a shared but different experience. I had a cousin who had moved from Mexicali, and he didn't speak English, and he was worried about his clothing. And so the character in this book is kind of him. And I remember at the time going, okay, this is my cousin, but we're very different and we come from very different backgrounds. So it kind of speaks to what Isabel was saying about having very different experiences and knowing even within your family that you have these different experiences with being Mexican American. But the story itself about having this mythical creature and knowing that he exists in all these different cultures, that was appealing to me once I started doing research. And this book actually came off a writing prompt, and it was write about the thing that scared you the most as a child and try to make it less scary. And all these things started coming out about my childhood, my insecurities, about, how kids treated me. And like Isabel said, kids called me a wetback and a beaner. I had no idea what that meant, and went home and had to ask my parents. And I love that you called out the girl's name who said that. But, and what maybe, what Isabel's experience was different. We have very different backgrounds, but we have been clumped into a category. And the same with having different pieces of our culture, they mean very different things to different people within our community. And so I think that when like YuYi's book too, I can look at her book and get something from it. I can get something from the images and the pictures, and they're very different from her experience. So I think as writers, when we write from our culture, it's not just we're bringing in our experience, but the person reading it is going to garner or gain something very different from that. And it's going to have something very different emotionally for them and how it appeals to them than it did for us, even as writers.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So Isabel, I want to ask you about this next, because I know there's a spread in my Papi has a motorcycle, where she talks about the mural in the city that sort of honors the history of the area. And to me, that seemed like the thing that was like most like connecting to a very specific reference. But again, the neighborhood that she's going through, like to me, it looks a lot like Mexican American neighborhoods that I knew growing up in New Mexico and California and Texas. But it could be, it could be another Latinx diasporic community. But then again, there's this moment with this mural that's alluding to a very specific historic reference.
Yeah, so I mean, the mural, I think I put it in the author's notes. It's not real, right? Like Zeke took all of this history and he put it together in this mural, and I think it was a really great addition to the story to kind of put everything kind of together visually for the reader. But yeah, I think specificity when we're writing it is incredibly important. And I don't try to write for, the Latinx community at large, because to do that would be like artifice, right? Like that wouldn't be honest. And it's impossible to do that, just like there is no universal story, there is no universal Latinx story, right? And like I can't pretend to speak for Afro Latinos or indigenous folks, and that are lumped in with Latinx community, whether they want to be or not, right? Like that's something that I can't speak to. I can speak about a young girl that grew up in the Inland Empire of Southern California who happened to be Mexican American. I can speak to that, right? To that, my particular experience. And so anything I write comes from that experience, right? Like anything I write comes from being, from living in this area, from growing up with parents that I had, from learning, how to be Mexican from them, or like what it meant to be Mexican, right? From these two people, like, and it varies from family to family, right? Like I can't, like even the families we grew up around, right? Like a lot of Mexican families, they have, they'll use, certain, curse words to talk to their kids, right? Like my family didn't, right? Like my family didn't, certain Mexican families, there's this like stereotype that it's like huge families and these huge gatherings and like tios and tias. There's two of us. There's my brother and there's me. And, my dad, he's the only one of his immediate family here. His other 5 brothers and sisters and his parents were still in Mexico, right? So there is a lot of stereotypes and a lot of assumptions, even within Mexican communities that, that aren't true for all of us. And so like, I can only write from, from my experience. And I like to use that. I really, like, I feel like I'm like, everything that you said, I'm agreeing with that, right? Like this idea of, like the books that I'm writing now, everything that I'm writing now, or a lot of it takes place in this area, right? Like, because this area to me is very important. And there is a lot of Latinx community here. But this is where my life has been. So a lot of it you're going to see in my work is going to be like replicated. You're going to see like, oh, like she mentioned this city before, and like this is where it's happening, right? But for example, when my Papi has a motorcycle, like that, Zeke was very purposeful in making, La Carniceria, the neighborhood look like a Latinx neighborhood that you would find in a lot of communities, right? Like a Mexican American, a Mexican carniceria that you would find in other communities across the country. I sent him photographs of the city. Like my mom took me on my mom took me around the circle, which if you look at the front of the book, there's a circle, right? There's the racetrack and at the end papers. And like, I took a video of it and I sent it to Zeke so he could illustrate it, right? Like all of that, but it's very specific to that location, but it's also, like you said, you can see these markets and these places and other places, right? And for example, he took like the sunset colors of El Paso and Southern California to use for the palette for the book, right? So you do see some similarities across communities, but there are some things that make it our own, right? So anyway, I feel like I rambled, but yes, be specific. And no, I'm not trying to speak for like the whole Latinx, but I'm glad that people do see themselves in the book. And I do think that the more specific you make a book, the more people will find a connection with.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that that's true of your book too, Matt. Yours and Isabel seemed even though in a lot of ways are like very, very different, different books, different stories, but they do have this shared aesthetic of this little girl just moving through this community, through this neighborhood that is super textured and super specific and super well realized. And I do think that, Matt, in your book, that just seeing Carmela explore this neighborhood is such a big part of it. And so much of what's specific about it is like it's in the setting, in the space that she's going through, and then also in some of her, in some of the worries that Carmela is carrying with her. But it's specific and it's not sort of spelled out. It's kind of evoked in other ways.
Yeah, I think I really like what Isabel said about specificity becoming so universal. And I think what she's also speaking to is that in being specific and writing what you know, you're also trusting the reader to take what they need to take from it. I think sometimes we get into trouble as authors if we try to control the whole equation, where like, this is what I'm trying to deliver to you as a writer. Well, I think that's very arrogant. I think what you need to do is write the best story you can. And then when the book comes out, people will use it how they're going to use it. And sometimes that will be, conversations about immigration. So for Carmela, there are so many people in this country living in what are called mixed status families, where, somebody in the family is undocumented. And Carmela is one of those people. We really wanted to frame it as an American story, though, because it's so common in this country. And that's why subversively we wanted the cover to be really the American flag. It's red, white, and blue. The stripes are on her shirt, the stars of the dandelion spores. Yeah. So it's like, this is an American story. And in listening to you all, I'm just thinking about how complicated it all is. I remember, so my experience as a writer is really the Mexican American culture. I remember I moved to New York City, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's other people like Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. I only knew the Mexican Americans experience. We lived so close to the border that we would cross every Sunday to visit my grandfather who moved back, and we would have lunch there on Sunday. Here's what was fascinating. In America, we were considered poor, living in a sketchy neighborhood in National City. We'd cross the border, and we'd get out of the car, and we'd be walking to my grandfather's house, and the kids in the neighborhood would say, "Here comes the rich kids." So it was so interesting that this arbitrary border changed the way I viewed myself and the way others viewed me, the world viewed me. So I tried to sort of speak to those complications. And I always say, sometimes I don't even know what a book is really about until readers tell me what it's about. And then, of course, I claim that that's what I was trying to do when I go to the next school. But I try to just honor the way people are going to use the story I'm trying to tell. Because I think that's beautiful. Like, that's the most amazing part of storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really lovely moment in the book where, I mean, the whole story is just sort of geared around this girl. It's her birthday, and she's sort of thinking of what she wants to wish for, and she has this. This is kind of one of my favorite moments. So she's like, also I like the visual, the papel picado look, but she says that she's imagining her dad getting his paper fixed so he could finally go home, and that's just seems like a very like beautiful and authentic way to communicate that, because it's through a very like real thing that happens, just a girl like who doesn't really understand all the context and all the politics, just wanting her dad, and very naturally articulating that on her birthday. And that is something, again, not necessarily unique to Mexican American migrant families, but certainly something that that many of them experience. And I just really like the way that it's done without it's done through sort of the character's emotion and her very natural wishes, rather than in this very purposeful way where there's no like, it's just because that doesn't ever work, does it? If you're trying to,
well, if you're going to do that, you should write an essay. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Write a think piece.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, all of you, for those really thoughtful answers. I want to talk a little bit more about sort of this idea of community, because we've been talking about sort of your own experiences as people who grew up in diasporic communities. And I think that despite these 4 books being incredibly different, was one thing that I saw a little bit in all of them. And I thought it was actually interesting because there seemed to be like a really neat analog, like between like Donna and YuYi's books, where the feeling that's being investigated is more when you first arrive elsewhere and you feel alienated and you feel lonely. And then in Matt and Isabel, in your books, it's sort of a little bit, maybe a little further along in the sort of experience of migrating elsewhere, where you found your people, you found a community, or you've had to build one, but that it's not given. It's not like when you arrive here, you're one of us, welcome, no problem, you'll be fine wherever. So if all of you could just talk a little bit about, how you, like, I'm just interested to talk about how all 4 of you ended up touching on such similar themes in such completely different ways. Should we have Donna first? Sorry, just picking at random.
Sure. So, I mean, in the perspective from my book, I think any child who either moved from another country or just moving across country like Matt did can, it will resonate with them in a way. It's that fear of the unknown and going into a situation where you don't know how you're going to be treated, or how you're going, if you're, the acceptance or non-acceptance that you're going to get. And I wanted to show that. And I wanted, even a child who it's just their first day of school could read this book and go, wow, I'm afraid to go. And I wanted to, I guess, like Matt said, I wasn't going into this writing a book about fear. It just happened. And so the themes just came naturally in that respect. But I guess I feel that, anyone picking up any of our books can touch on the themes of traveling and going to places and not knowing how are going to be treated by someone else. But and in my book, there is no resolution. There's just hope and hoping. And that's, I think that's all you can do, because even my book, even El Cucuy is scared, and he's the scariest thing ever in the world. And so even if he's afraid of it, it just shows us that we can all have that fear, but that there's hope, and to try, and there's, themes of bravery, which not all of us are brave all the time. Not all of us have our voice, but to show that, it's worth a try, and it's worth trying to have hope for those things.
Yeah, absolutely. YuYi?
Here, thank you. So I've been thinking about your question, like, how do we come with different stories, even though we seem to be speaking about the same experience? I don't know that I have an answer exactly for that. I think that at some point we are, like Matt said, we are just trying to write the best story that we can with what we have. I know that in my case, my stories are fed from my own experiences, also from the curiosity that I have about things. And one of the things that I realize nowadays is that even though when I started making my books, I had like a mission. I wanted to tell my son, who was just an infant, to tell him the stories that he was missing, because we weren't in the place where grandmothers and aunts and everybody will tell him those stories. And I knew that I had things to say to him, and I wanted to make those stories for him. And then I found myself in the path of my voice actually having an outlet, being in a book that someone else was going to read. And now I don't even have a baby, that I have to tell those stories too. But I recognize now that as I've been growing up, also the reasons why I make books have become different too. And for me nowadays, the importance of who the reader is paramount. To me, is the biggest thing. Now it's not anymore making the stories that are gonna give me my own, where I defend the things that I have to say and my voice. Now they are much more about the reader and what I am exploring also in how we give those stories to our children and to children, all of them. And I think that we are learning a lot. I'm speaking maybe for everybody, but I want to speak for myself. I know that I'm learning a lot as I make stories, and that the reason why I made the stories at the beginning are not the same way I'm making the stories right now. And that the way I see the stories that I was telling, I can be very critical as well of how I was telling those stories, because now I have to put everything that I've learned through the process to decide whether my story is actually adding in richness, in healing, in identity, in everything that a child is living right now, if it is adding to their well-being as well. So for me now, books are more of a process of learning how we are going to tell our stories and how they are valuable, and much less about whether I have to show something that I am, whether I'm Mexican or I'm already a Mexican American. They don't have to do as much to that anymore.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I jump in there on that? Because I think that is such an an awesome idea. And I think the way I would describe it is, I think a lot of authors we don't have answers to the big questions of the day, such as immigration, the American dream, but we're drawn to them. We're drawn to those questions. So if I look at all my books, they're exploring similar themes. And I've heard a couple times YuYi and also Isabel have kind of echoed this idea of like, we're repeating ourselves, but I think that's what writers do. We're drawn to the same sort of question and we're exploring it from different angles. And if I look at my books, the two big things I'm always thinking about are, what is the American dream and how is it different for different communities? I remember the American dream in my community when I was growing up is just for people not to see us, because then we're going to be just safe to live our lives. Nobody's going to try to take us away or send us back. We just want to exist here. So we're not trying to have political agency. We're just trying to be safe. And then this idea of freedom, which I think is fascinating. Like, what does it mean to have this American concept of freedom when you're growing up in a different community where you're not seen the same way? And it's fascinating for me as just a human going through life and feeling like I was always on the margins of every group that I tried to be a part of. So obviously, I talked about the Mexican American culture, but then also the white culture. And then I went and played basketball in college. And so I was a college athlete, but yet I love to write poetry. So they would make fun of me for doing that. Then I went to an MFA program and I thought I was going to be with my people. And they were like, since when are we letting jocks into this program? So I think sometimes you become very curious, like Juji said, when you are sort of on the margins of a group. And I think it's kind of like what I'm doing in all my work.
Okay, and Isabel, I don't know if you want to add to that quickly. I need to start taking some audience questions, but do you have anything to add to that? Sorry, you're muted.
No, now I'm there. Yeah, I think I like what Matt said about like writers drawn to questions, right? Like immediately I'm like, what am I writing about in my work, right? And I think that for me, I write about community and growing up, right? Like I write about where I'm at. And I think specifically because this area of California has often been looked at, like we're called like the armpit of like Southern California. Like people are always talking crap about where we live. And so like I feel like I want to write about this place because this place is my home. And like nobody likes it when people talk badly about your home, right? Like nobody, this is like where I live. This is where my son lives. This is where my partner lives, where my family lives. And so I want to write about this area. And I just want to tell stories. And I think that, I kept thinking about like all of us talked about how complicated it is to be in this position, right? But the only reason it's complicated is like you said before, is because we're in the United States. That is the only reason it's complicated. It's only complicated because we are constantly pushed to assimilate, to tell certain stories or to live a certain story and to give up whatever we brought with us, right? Or whatever our families brought with us or whatever we want to hold on to. If I wanted to assimilate and say like, I'm going to be whatever American is, right? I'm going to stop speaking Spanish. I'm going to stop thinking about, the stories I had when I grew up. I'm going to stop what my parents brought to this country. My life would be so much easier, right? Like my life would be so much sadder also, right? But it wouldn't be as complicated, right? Like, and I think like I want to think about those complications in the work that I have, but not as complications, but just as like, this is life, this is like reality. And so, I don't know if I answered that question or if I added anything, but those were thoughts that I had that everyone based on what everyone was talking about.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's been a really, really, I think, thought-provoking conversation. So I'm going to take a few participant questions now. I have one here that's really interesting. This is from Melissa Garcia. And she asks, how does your creative process capture kid language within your adult perspective? And this is something I'm really interested to hear, because to me, the thought of writing a picture book is like impossible. So I would love to know more about that.
I can give a quick start. So I remember when I read, I feel like there are two kinds of picture books. So we have two audiences, right? We have the adult and we have the child that's sitting on the adult's lap sometimes, or sitting in the classroom of a teacher. And I feel like you have those two audiences, but I think you're always in the best place if you sort of lean toward the child. And I think of like Where the Wild Things Are. And really that's just about child psychology and about a child trying on adult sensibilities, like I'm going to send the monster to bed without its supper or whatever. So I just want to, I at least try to honor child psychology, because I think it's beautiful and interesting. And I have two young kids and I'm watching them sort of navigate the world, and sometimes through books. So that's the way I try to approach it.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think I'm asked this question about how like I write for different audiences, right? For young and like language, right? I think respecting kids is really important, respecting the audience, not talking down to them. Because I've read books where that the author is like, this is what I think a kid should sound like, or this is their intelligence. So I'm going to, talk down to them because I don't think kids are smart. Kids are super smart. And so, and they know a lot and they're just experiencing the world for the first time. And so keeping all of those things in mind, I think is really important when we're writing books for kids, and also listening to children. And, if you don't like children and if you don't like children's books, you shouldn't be writing children's books at all, right? And I've met those two types of authors. Like I remember doing an event with someone that said like, I hate kids, but I know I'll make money writing chapter books for kids. And I like wanted to punch her in the face, but I didn't. I was just very polite. But like, don't dumb down your audience. Like kids know. And so just like respect them like you would any reader. Like if you're writing for adults, you wouldn't dumb down things for adults, right? Like you would respect your audience. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think kids like being taken seriously.
Yeah, I wanna say something about that too. Isabel was talking about respect, and it makes me realize how when we are doing this work, we do need some tools, right? We need to learn how to write a story. We need to. I like to study how different ages kids, how they incorporate language in their lives and or visuals and things like that. I think that's part of our craft and how we do what we do. But one of the things that is very important to me is what is the attitude that we as authors have when we approach the work we do? Because as much as we are sometimes demanding and just telling others to respect our work and our identity, sometimes and not come and save us from our mistakes. Sometimes we tend to have those attitudes towards the work that we do for children as well. And we feel that we are here the saviors who are bringing to children the books that they need so that they can become better people, especially when you are talking about children who come from communities from Mexico or Mexican Americans, or that come from all the way down from the continent. We tend to believe that they are coming to the United States and then they are going to be receiving our literature so that they can finally become something that they were not when they were in their countries of origin, or when they had only the knowledge and the wisdom of their families, and to be able to not come as an author thinking that we are going to save children from their own lives and their own identity. I think that's very, very important to me. For me, children are already perfect. We should be learning from them rather than trying to transform them as we think that they should be.
Well, I think that is a perfect thought to end on. So thank you all so much for joining. This was a really, really lovely conversation. And I appreciate you all making the time to come and talk to us about these incredible books and to share a little bit about your experiences. Thank you so much.